The train pulled into Caldwell Station just after 2 in the afternoon, and the platform was loud with the sounds of men unloading freight and horses stamping at the hitching posts along the far fence. Elena Navarro pressed her face briefly to the smudged window glass before she stood, smoothed the front of her dress with both palms. A habit she'd had since she was small, her mother's voice in her head saying, "You walk in looking like you belong there," and reached up for her travel bag in the overhead rack. It was the only bag she had. Everything she owned that mattered fit inside it. She'd been on trains for 4 days. Street. Lewis first, then the long crawl westward through Kansas, then the branch line south into Colorado territory, the landscape going flat, and then strange, and then beautiful in ways she hadn't expected. She'd pressed her face to the glass for that last stretch, watching the low mountains rise up in the west like something out of a painting she'd seen once in a schoolhouse back home. She'd let herself feel hopeful during that part. She'd allowed herself to imagine, just for a little while, what the next chapter of her life might look like. She was 24 years old. She'd spent those years in a cramped tenement in St. Louis, working in her aunt's laundry since she was 14, stitching through other people's lives from the outside. When the letter came, a formal proposal written by a man named Douglas Holt, who'd placed an advertisement in a Saint Louis paper seeking a capable woman of good character for marriage, she'd answered it not out of desperation, but out of something closer to clarity. She was not going to grow old in that laundry room. She was not going to spend another decade watching someone else's life through a window. Douglas Holt had written back. 3 letters total, each one careful and measured. He owned a cattle ranch outside Caldwell, he'd said. He was looking for a wife who was practical, hardworking, and willing to build something real in a hard place. He said nothing about beauty. He said nothing about romance. Those were things Elena respected. She'd written back in kind. Practical, honest, no pretense. She told him she could keep accounts, manage a household, work alongside anyone without complaint. She told him she was part Mexican on her mother's side, because she wasn't going to let that come out later like something she'd tried to hide. He'd written back a 3rd time confirming the date of her arrival. That was what she'd held on to for 6 weeks while she saved every dollar she could, settled what she owed her aunt, packed her bag, and climbed onto the first train heading west. She came down the platform steps and stood in the afternoon glare, squinting against the Colorado sun, which was stronger than she'd expected. The station was a plain wooden structure, its signboard weathered down to almost nothing. Beyond it, she could see the main street of Caldwell. Maybe 3 blocks of storefronts, a saloon, a dry goods, a church at the far end. Horses everywhere. A smell of dust and animal, and something sharp and dry she couldn't name. She scanned the platform. Douglas Holt had described himself in his second letter as tall, fair-haired, wearing a dark brown hat with a silver band. She found him almost immediately. He was standing near the far end of the platform with 2 other men, the 3 of them watching the freight cars being unloaded. She recognized something about the set of his jaw even from a distance, the proprietary way he held himself in his own territory. She started toward him. He turned as she approached, and she saw his face register her, saw something flicker across his expression that she'd spent her whole life learning to read. She stopped about 6 feet from him. "Mr. Holt," she said. "I'm Elena Navarro." For a moment he said nothing. The 2 men beside him went quiet. One of them looked at his boots. The other watched with the particular attentiveness of someone who senses something interesting about to happen. Douglas Holt looked at her. He looked at her the way people sometimes did, not at her face but at the sum of her, calculating something, arriving at a conclusion. She was brown-skinned in the afternoon sun. Her hair was dark and heavy, and she'd pinned it back carefully that morning, but there was no mistaking what he was seeing. "I read your letter," he said finally. "Then you know who I am." "I know what you wrote." He said it slowly, like he was deciding something as he spoke. "I didn't take it seriously enough." The words landed flat. Around them, the platform noise continued, men calling to each other, a horse snorting somewhere, the last passengers from her train moving past with their bags. Everything just kept going. "You're saying you won't honor the arrangement," Elena said. She kept her voice level. She'd learned that too. Learned it the way you learn to keep your hand steady when what you really want to do is pull it back. "I'm saying it won't work." He met her eyes then, and she could see that he wasn't embarrassed, which was almost worse. He wasn't ashamed. He'd made a calculation and he was simply communicating its result. I've got men working for me. I've got neighbors. People around here have expectations about... He paused. About how things are done. About who a man marries. He didn't answer that directly. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded bill, held it out toward her. For your trouble. There's a hotel down the street. You can take the eastbound train day after tomorrow. She looked at the money. She didn't take it. Keep it, she said. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. She sat on the bench at the far end of the platform for a long time. She didn't cry. That came later, usually, after the thing that deserved tears had already passed and something quieter had settled in its place. Right now, she just sat with her bag between her feet and calculated what she had left. $22 and some change. The return ticket to St. Louis, which she'd bought open-dated because her aunt had warned her not to burn anything she couldn't rebuild. Enough to pay for 2 nights at whatever the cheapest room in that hotel down the street turned out to be, with a little left over. And then what? Go back to the laundry. Spend another year or 5 or 10 watching steam rise off other people's tablecloths. Marry someone from the neighborhood who would treat her tolerably and expect nothing too wild from her. Live quietly and die quietly, and be remembered by a small number of people for a short period of time. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and stared at the mountains to the west. They were still there, still doing what mountains did, which was simply existing without any particular concern for what was happening at the Caldwell train station on a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. She became aware, after a while, that she was being watched. She turned her head slowly and found a child standing about 10 feet away on the platform, studying her with the unguarded curiosity that belongs exclusively to children under the age of 10. The girl was maybe 7, maybe 8, small-boned and fair, with dark eyes that seemed too big for her face and braids that had come partly undone, one of them trailing over her shoulder in a fraying rope. She was wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the original color was anybody's guess, and her boots were good, but scuffed hard. She was staring at Elena with complete openness, not the calculation Elena had seen in Douglas Holt's eyes, just straightforward interest. "Are you lost?" the girl asked. Elena considered the question. "I don't think you can be lost if you're sitting still," she said. The girl thought about this. You could be lost and sitting still. That's true, Elena admitted. What's your name? Emma Walker. The girl moved a step closer, apparently satisfied that conversation was acceptable. You came off the train. I did. Are you staying in Caldwell? Elena looked back at the mountains. I haven't decided yet. Emma Walker came and sat on the bench beside her, which Elena had not invited her to do, and which she found, unexpectedly, she didn't mind. The girl sat with her legs dangling because the bench was too high for her feet to reach the ground, and she looked out at the same nothing Elena was looking at, and for a few minutes they were both just quiet. My papa's over there, Emma said finally, nodding toward the freight area. He's picking up fence wire. He says it takes forever because they always pack it wrong. Does he? Every time. She said it with the resigned certainty of someone who had heard this complaint enough times to have absorbed it as fact. Where are you from? St. Louis? Is that far? 4 days on the train. Emma seemed to digest this. Did you come to see someone? Elena was quiet for a moment. I thought I did, she said. It didn't work out. The girl turned and looked at her with those oversized dark eyes, and there was something in her face that was too knowing for 7 or 8, some early familiarity with disappointment. Sometimes things don't, Emma said. Not meanly, just as information. No, Elena agreed. Sometimes they don't. Emma's father came around the corner of the freight building about 20 minutes later. Elena had expected him to be alarmed when he found his daughter sitting next to a stranger, but he didn't seem alarmed so much as tired. He was a man in his mid-30s, she guessed, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than intention, with a face that had been weathered a decade ahead of his probable age. Dark hair, poorly cut, a jaw that needed shaving 2 days ago. His coat had a mended tear along the left sleeve that someone had done carefully, but with thread that didn't quite match. He looked at Elena, then at Emma, then back at Elena. She started it, Elena said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. Emma. He said it in the particular flat tone of a parent who has had this conversation before. She was sitting alone, Emma said, with the absolute conviction of someone who believes this fully justifies everything. She came from St. Louis. That's 4 days on the train. Cole Walker looked at Elena again. Cole Walker, he said. He didn't offer his hand, which she realized after a beat was because he was carrying a coil of fencing wire over his right shoulder. Elena Navarro. A pause that wasn't quite awkward. He was reading her the way people did out here. She was coming to understand. But it felt different from how Douglas Holt had done it. Less like calculation, more like simple assessment. "You're staying in town?" he asked. "I was considering it." She glanced down at her bag. "I haven't entirely decided." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. She could see him adding things up, and she had a moment of something defensive rising in her chest, the familiar preparation for whatever was coming next. But what he said was, "Hotel on First Street is the only one. Decent enough. Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's fair." "Thank you." He nodded, started to turn away, and Emma made no move to follow him, which seemed to remind him of something. He turned back to his daughter. "Come on, Em." "She doesn't have anywhere to go," Emma said. She said it simply, not accusingly, the way she might report that it was raining or that the creek was running high. Just a fact that seemed relevant. Cole Walker looked at Elena one more time, and she could see something working behind his eyes. She'd have preferred him not to look at her at all, honestly. She didn't want to be a situation someone else had to solve. "I'm fine," she said before he could say anything. "Truly, your daughter was kind to sit with me. I appreciate it." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press it either. "Mrs. Patterson's place," he repeated, and turned, and Elena watched him disappear around the corner of the freight building, with Emma trotting at his heels. She stayed on the bench another 10 minutes. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the hotel. Mrs. Patterson was a compact, gray-haired woman with a permanently skeptical expression that Elena suspected was structural rather than personal. She gave Elena a room on the second floor without commentary, which was more than Elena had expected, and she told her breakfast was at 7 and supper at 6, and there was a basin of water in the room, and that was that. The room was small and smelled of cedar and old wallpaper. There was a window that looked out over the alley behind the building. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her bag at her feet and let herself be tired for a while. She was 24 years old, she had $22, and she was 1,500 miles from everything she knew. She thought about her mother, briefly. Her mother had come up from Sonora when she was 19, alone, speaking almost no English, carrying a single bag not unlike the one sitting on the floor of this room right now. She'd made a life. A hard one, a short one. She'd died of fever when Elena was 11, but a real one. She'd built something with her hands in a place that hadn't particularly wanted her there. You walk in looking like you belong there. Elena looked at the ceiling of the room. The plaster had a crack running corner to corner, like a map of somewhere. She was not getting back on that eastbound train. That much she knew. The next morning she was at the hotel's small dining table by 7, and she sat across from a traveling salesman from Denver who talked non-stop about carpet samples, and beside an elderly rancher who was deaf in one ear and so didn't respond to anything the salesman said. And the three of them had a breakfast of eggs and bread and coffee in a comfortable arrangement of mutual non-engagement. Afterward, she walked the main street. She was looking at the town the way her aunt had taught her to look at things. Practically, from the outside, asking what it needed and what it had, and whether those two things matched up. The dry goods store was overstocked on the wrong side of its inventory. Too many bolts of imported fabric that nobody out here was going to buy. And a shortage of practical goods she could see from the half-empty shelves visible through the window. The saloon opened at 10 in the morning, which told her something. The church at the end of the street had a fresh coat of whitewash and clean windows, and an empty hitching post out front. She was standing outside a general supply looking at a handwritten notice in the window. Woman needed for housekeeping, inquire within. When someone said her name, she turned. It was Emma Walker, slightly out of breath, dark braids still in the same state of managed disorder as the day before. The girl had appeared as if assembled from nothing. I thought you left, Emma said. I didn't. Emma seemed pleased by this. Papa's at the feed store. He's going to be there forever. He always talks to Mr. Hennessy forever. She fell into step beside Elena without being asked, which was apparently something she did. Are you looking for work? Elena looked at the notice in the window. Possibly. Mrs. Aldrich in there is mean, Emma said. She said it with the same dispassionate matter-of-factness she seemed to bring to most things. She made the last woman cry. Elena looked at her. How do you know that? Everybody knows. She didn't go in. She found Cole Walker at the feed store exactly where Emma had predicted, in the middle of a conversation with a man she assumed was Mr. Hennessy, a large, red-faced man with genuinely impressive sideburns who was in the middle of a story that Cole Walker did not appear to be particularly engaged with. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, doing the thing where you appear to be listening because it would be rude not to, while your eyes are somewhere else entirely. He saw Elena and Emma come in, and something in his posture shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, a small recalibration. Emma went immediately to examine something on the far shelf that seemed to have caught her attention, leaving Elena standing near the doorway, which was not ideal. Miss Navarro, Cole said. Mr. Hennessy paused mid-sentence and looked at her with the transparent curiosity of a small-town man who had just identified an unfamiliar element in his environment. I'm sorry to interrupt, Elena said. Emma brought me. She does that, Cole said. He uncrossed his arms, glanced at Mr. Hennessy. Bill, I'll see you Thursday. He moved away from the counter, and Hennessy watched them with poorly concealed interest as Cole walked to where Elena was standing near the door. They went outside. Emma materialized beside them, as if by instinct. Cole looked at Elena. That same assessing look as the day before, not unkind but direct. Are you still at the hotel? Until tomorrow. Then I need to figure something out. He was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past on the street, raising dust, and the three of them stood in it. Can you actually keep accounts? He asked. Or was that just something you put in a letter? She looked at him. Where did you hear about a letter? Small town, he said, with something that was probably as close to apology as he usually got. She supposed she'd had that coming. She supposed everyone at Douglas Holt's ranch had known about the arrangement, and some of them had been in town since yesterday, and the thing that surprised her wasn't that the information had spread, but that it had taken until now for someone to mention it directly to her face. I can keep accounts, she said. I've been doing it since I was 14. My aunt ran a commercial laundry. 6 employees, suppliers in 3 states, seasonal contracts with 2 hotels. I tracked all of it. He looked at her steadily. My books are a mess, he said. I haven't... He stopped, started again. My wife kept them. She died 3 years ago. I haven't been able to sort them out since. Something in his voice was different when he said that. Not soft, exactly. He didn't seem like a man who went easily soft, but stripped down to something plain and unguarded for just a moment. Emma's told me, Elena said quietly. He glanced at his daughter, who was examining something on the ground about 5 feet away with great concentration, pretending convincingly not to be listening to every word. I can't pay much, he said. The ranch has been... He rubbed the back of his neck. It's been a hard couple of years. I don't need much, Elena said. I need time to figure out my next step. A room and fair wages for however long the work takes. He was quiet for a beat that stretched a little longer than comfortable. It's not a grand place, he said finally. The house needs work. Emma's... Another pause. She takes some managing. Emma, who was absolutely listening, said nothing. She continued to study the ground. I'll manage, Elena said. He nodded, once, the way a man does when he's made a decision and isn't going to second-guess it right now. In front of people, in the middle of a street. Supper's at 5:30, he said. The Walker Ranch was 7 miles out of Caldwell, which Elena learned by sitting in the wagon bed while Cole drove and Emma sat up front on the seat beside him. The road was rough and the afternoon sun had swung around to hit her squarely in the face for the last 3 miles, and she spent most of the ride cataloging what she could see of the landscape and trying not to think about Douglas Holt. The property came into view around a bend in the road. a two-story farmhouse with a covered porch, a barn that needed paint, three outbuildings in varying states of functionality, and fence lines that ran clean in some places and slumped badly in others. The land around it was high grassland, browning at the edges in the late summer heat. Two horses in the paddock, a kitchen garden that had clearly been started with intention and then struggled. She'd expected worse, and better, both at the same time. Cole helped her down from the wagon without particular ceremony and showed her the spare room on the upper floor, a narrow space with a single window facing east and a bed with a clean quilt on it that looked like it had been put there recently, maybe today, which meant he'd decided to offer her work before he'd run into her at the feed store, or he'd sent someone ahead, or he'd driven faster than she'd thought. She didn't ask. The room was small, and it was hers. That was enough. He left her to settle in, and she stood in the middle of the floor with her bag at her feet for the second time in 2 days. Through the window she could see the far fence line, and beyond it the empty land, and beyond that the mountains, still there, still doing what they did. She thought, I don't know if this is going to work. She thought, but I'm not leaving. Supper that first night was quiet in the specific way that happens when people who don't know each other are trying not to cause problems. Cole Walker did not make small talk easily. Elena could see that within the first 5 minutes. He asked Emma about her day with the economical precision of a man who was genuinely interested but not going to perform interest he didn't feel, and Emma answered in her usual way, thorough, unself-conscious, including more detail than was strictly necessary, and occasionally circling back to things she'd already said as if she'd reconsidered them. Elena ate and listened and offered things when she was asked directly and otherwise stayed out of the way. After Emma went up to bed, Cole showed Elena the ledger books. They were stacked on a shelf in the small room off the kitchen that served as some kind of office. 3 fat ledgers, their spines cracked, and a loose pile of papers that had clearly been deposited there in stages over 3 years without any unifying principle. She looked at them. She didn't say anything negative about the state of them, which seemed to be what he was braced for, and she could see something in him relax slightly when she just picked up the top ledger and opened it. "Your wife did these?" she asked. "Yes." She turned a page. The handwriting was careful and small, a woman who had taken the work seriously. She could see where it stopped. March of 3 years ago, mid-entry, as if interrupted. And then nothing for 6 months. And then Cole's own hand starting up again, larger and less precise. Clearly a man doing something he knew was necessary but had not been trained for. "It's not as bad as you think," she said. He made a sound that was probably skepticism. "I've seen worse," she said. "Give me 2 days with these before you show them to anyone or make any decisions based on them." He nodded. She looked up and found him watching her, not the way Douglas Holt had watched her, not the way Hennessy had watched her through the feed store window, something quieter than that. "Why didn't you get back on the eastbound train?" he asked. It wasn't accusing, it was a genuine question. Elena looked at the ledger in her hands, at the careful handwriting of a woman who'd kept something running for years before she died, at the rough columns of a man trying to continue something he hadn't been built for. "Because I didn't come all this way to go back," she said. He didn't say anything to that. After a moment, he put a lantern on the desk for her and went upstairs, and Elena sat down in the chair that had probably been his wife's chair and opened the first ledger at the beginning and started reading. Outside, the Colorado night pressed up against the window. The mountains were out there somewhere in the dark, doing what mountains did. She turned the page and kept reading. She worked through half the night on those ledgers. Not because she had to. Cole Walker had said 2 days, and 2 days was reasonable, but because once she started, she couldn't stop. There was something almost compulsive about it, the way a tangle of thread will pull you in once you find the right end to start with. She sat in that chair with the lantern throwing yellow light across the pages and worked backward and forward through 3 years of a ranch's financial life. And what she found was not the disaster she'd half expected. It was something stranger. It was a ranch that should have been fine. The Walker property, she could see this now, in the columns and receipts and the careful notations in his late wife's handwriting, had operated at a modest but real profit for the better part of 8 years. Cattle sales solid, land taxes paid, debts manageable. And then Margaret Walker had died, and something had gone sideways. Not catastrophically, not all at once, more like a slow leak. Bills that had been paid quarterly were now stretched to 6 months. A loan from the Caldwell First National that had been taken out 18 months ago under terms that were, Elena looked at it twice, not good. Not good at all. The interest was structured in a way she'd seen before. Her aunt's laundry had been offered something similar once, and her aunt, who had not survived 40 years in business by being naive, had refused it and had explained to Elena exactly why. It was the kind of loan that looked manageable until it wasn't, that required you to refinance at a worse rate just when things got hard. That had the bank's fingerprints all over it, but left the borrower with nothing to stand on legally. She made a note on a separate sheet of paper. She made several notes. At some point, she became aware that the lantern was burning low and that the window had gone from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn. She put down the pen, rubbed her eyes, and sat back in the chair that had been Margaret Walker's chair. She thought, he doesn't know how bad this loan is. She thought, someone sold him this loan knowing he was grieving and not paying attention. She blew out the lantern and went upstairs to bed. She slept 4 hours and was up again before Emma, which turned out to mean before anyone, because Cole Walker had already been gone to the barn when she came downstairs. She found coffee on the stove, a tin pot, still hot, which meant he'd made it and left it for her, which was a small thing, but not nothing. And she poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the barn and thought about what she'd found in those books. Emma came down at 7, her braids freshly redone, badly, but with effort, and her dress only slightly crooked at the collar. She seemed to operate on an internal schedule that did not depend on anyone else telling her it was morning. "You were up late," Emma said, getting herself a cup of water from the basin. "How do you know?" "I saw the light under your door when I got up to use the outhouse." Elena looked at her. "What time was that?" "I don't know. Late." Emma sat down at the table with the comfort of someone who had always sat at that table and expected to continue doing so. "Did you find something wrong?" Elena sat down across from her. She hadn't planned to talk to an 8-year-old about this, but Emma Walker had a way of asking questions that made evasion feel slightly absurd. "I found some things that need attention," she said carefully. "Nothing that can't be sorted out." Emma looked at her with those dark eyes. "Papa worries about the money," she said. "He doesn't say so, but I can tell. He gets very quiet." "I noticed he's quiet generally. He's quieter now than before Mama died." She said it the way she said most things. Plainly, not to wound or perform grief, but simply as fact. "He used to laugh more. Mr. Hennessy told me that." Elena turned her cup in her hands. Outside she could hear something from the barn. The sound of a man working, hooves on packed dirt, a horse making a complaint about something. "Emma," she said, "does your father have a lawyer? Anyone he's worked with?" Emma thought about it. "Mr. Greer in town does the legal papers. He did something for Papa last year about the fence line." "Greer," Elena repeated. She added the name to her internal list. Ma'am. She spent the morning in the office going through the loose papers she'd set aside the night before. By noon, she had them sorted into 4 categories, and she'd found 2 things that surprised her. One of them unpleasantly, one of them the opposite. The unpleasant thing was a secondary note on the property that she hadn't noticed the night before, attached to the main loan, that gave the Caldwell First National Bank a claim on the eastern pasture if the primary loan defaulted. Cole Walker had signed it. She doubted he'd understood what he was signing. The other thing was a water rights document, old and faded, filed in 1861 by someone named Thomas Walker, Cole's father, presumably, that granted the Walker Ranch first claim access to Sutter Creek through a specific channel running across the southern edge of the property. It had been recorded with the county land office. It was legal, and from what she could see in the accounts, it hadn't been exercised in at least a decade, possibly longer. She sat with that document for a long time. Cole came in for the noon meal, which Elena had put together from what she found in the kitchen. Beans and salt pork and bread that was a day old but not yet past it. He sat down across from her at the table and ate without much ceremony, and Emma sat beside him and talked enough for both of them, which seemed to be the established household dynamic. "I have questions about the books," Elena said, when Emma had temporarily redirected her attention to her food. Cole looked up. "All right. The loan from First National. Did anyone explain the refinancing terms to you before you signed? Something moved across his face. Not defensiveness, more like a man who is about to hear something he already half knows. Garrity at the bank explained it, said it was standard. It's not standard. She said it flat, no particular heat in it. The rate adjusts at 18 months, which is... She paused. You're coming up on 18 months. He set down his fork. The rate will go up, she said. Significantly. And there's a secondary note on the eastern pasture that... What secondary note? She got up and brought him the document. He read it. She watched his jaw tighten. I didn't know this was in there, he said. I didn't think you did. He put the paper down and looked at the table for a moment. Emma had gone very still in the way children do when they sense something serious is happening and are trying to be invisible. How bad is it? He asked. Manageable, Elena said. If you move before the 18 months is up, you have... She'd done the calculation that morning. About 6 weeks. He picked up his fork again, then put it back down. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was working something out. What do I do? First, you need to talk to Greer. The water rights document I found, if that's exercisable, it changes the value of the property significantly, which means you have leverage with the bank that you don't currently know you have. She paused. I want to look at it more carefully before I say more than that. But Cole... It was the first time she'd used his name directly, and she saw him register it. Someone sold you this loan knowing your situation. I'd like to know who suggested First National to you. He was quiet for a moment. Holt, he said. Douglas Holt. He said Garrity was reliable, that the bank was the best option when I needed the operating capital. Elena kept her face still. She took a breath through her nose and let it out slowly. All right, she said. Emma was looking at her. The girl had the distinct expression of someone who had understood more than the adults intended. She walked out to the southern fence line that afternoon with the water rights document folded in her pocket and the hand-drawn survey map she'd found tucked behind it. She walked the line as best she could in her city boots, which were not made for Colorado scrubland and were suffering for it. And she found the channel indicated on the map, dry now, packed clay at the bottom, but structurally there. It had been built with intention once, lined with flat stones along part of its length, the kind of work that takes real time. Cole found her there around 4. He'd come out to check the fence line for something else, she gathered, and found her crouched at the edge of the dry channel with the map spread on the ground beside her. He crouched down beside her without being asked. She showed him what she was looking at. This channel runs from Sutter Creek, she said. Or it did. Someone diverted it. She pointed to where the channel's upper end disappeared into a section of ground that had clearly been disturbed, rock fill, tamped down, grown over with grass that was younger than the surrounding growth, but old enough to look natural if you weren't paying attention. That fill is maybe 5, 6 years old, maybe less. Cole was very still. Holt's south fence, he said slowly, is about 200 yards north of here. She looked at him. He expanded his property 4 years ago, Cole said. Bought out 2 small operations. I didn't think much about it at the time. He looked at the filled channel, and she could see something hardening in his face. Not anger yet. Something preceding anger. The moment of comprehension. He blocked it. If the document I found is valid, and I believe it is, he blocked a water channel he had no legal right to touch. She sat back on her heels. Which means the Walker Ranch has had first-claim water rights to Sutter Creek for 20 years and hasn't been able to exercise them for the past several years because someone deliberately blocked the channel. And that same person then helped steer you into a loan that, if it defaulted, would let the bank claim the eastern pasture, which sits directly between his property and the rest of your land. Cole stood up. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking north toward where Holt's land started. He was going to end up with this whole piece, Cole said. It wasn't a question. That's what the numbers suggest. She stood up too, folded the map back along its creases. I'm not a lawyer. You need Greer to look at this, and you need someone who knows water rights law, which might not be Greer. There's a man in Pueblo, Cole said. He handled a case for the Hendersons 2 years back, water dispute. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it. Write to him this week, she said. Before anything else. Don't talk to Garrity at the bank about the loan yet. Don't do anything that tells Holt you found this. He looked at her. You found all this in the books. The document was just sitting there, in a pile. I put papers in that pile for 2 years, he said. I didn't. He stopped. You were keeping the ranch running, she said. You were raising Emma. You weren't going to catch everything. He was quiet. A hawk was circling somewhere high up, tilting in the afternoon thermals. The mountains were as they always were. Thank you, he said. It came out a little rough, like it wasn't something he said easily. Don't thank me yet, Elena said. It's going to get harder before it gets better. It did get harder. Not immediately. The first 2 weeks had a provisional calm to them, the specific quiet of people living alongside each other and learning the edges. She took over the kitchen accounts from the beginning of the 3rd day, not because anyone asked, but because she found she couldn't sit idle while things were running inefficiently, and there was an inefficiency in how supplies were being ordered that was adding up to real money. She reorganized the kitchen stores, renegotiated the weekly order from the Caldwell supply by shifting a few items to the monthly run from Pueblo, which was cheaper, and found them $6 a month without anyone going without anything. Cole noticed. He didn't say much about it, but he noticed. Emma noticed everything and said all of it, which was its own adjustment. The girl was in motion from the moment she woke up, and she had decided, with the total confidence of someone who has not yet learned to second-guess her own instincts, that Elena was interesting and worth knowing, and she pursued this project with energy. She wanted to know where Elena had grown up and what street Lewis looked like, and whether it was true that there were buildings there taller than 3 stories, and whether Elena's mother had been very beautiful, and what her father had been like. Elena answered most of it. She left some of it alone. Emma seemed to understand intuitively which was which. Was he mean? Emma asked one afternoon. They were in the kitchen, Elena doing accounts, Emma supposedly doing the schoolwork that arrived by post from the county school, and which she treated as a mild inconvenience. Who? Mr. Holt, when he sent you away. Elena looked up from the page. No, she said, after a moment. He wasn't mean about it. That was almost worse. He was just, she thought about it. He was practical about it, like it was a business decision. Emma chewed her pencil. This was a habit Elena had given up trying to stop. Papa says he's not a good man. Your father said that? He said it to Mr. Hennessy. I wasn't supposed to hear. Elena went back to her numbers. What else aren't you supposed to hear? Emma smiled, a quick, bright thing. Lots of things. The town started talking about the 3rd week. Elena had gone to Caldwell twice for supplies, and both times she'd felt the specific texture of a small community adjusting to new information. People looked at her with interest they didn't quite try to hide. A woman outside the dry goods store. She learned later her name was Mrs. Aldrich, the same Mrs. Aldrich who made women cry, had said something to a companion while looking in Elena's direction that Elena didn't catch fully but understood the shape of. A man at the feed counter had asked Pete, who ran the counter and was about 20 and mostly harmless, who the woman with the Walker order was, loudly enough to be heard. Pete had said, "She's working out at the Walker place," with the cautious neutrality of someone trying not to be involved in anything. The man had said, "Huh," in a way that meant several things. She understood how it looked. She was a single woman living on a widower's property, a stranger whose only known connection to Caldwell was the public fact that Douglas Holt had sent her away the afternoon she arrived. She understood that this made her, in the eyes of some people, either pitiable or suspicious, and that neither of those readings was going to be comfortable. What she hadn't anticipated was Holt himself. He rode out to the Walker Ranch on a Wednesday morning. Elena was in the office, Cole was in the field, and Emma was at the kitchen table when they heard the horse coming up the road. Emma was at the window before Elena could get up. "It's Mr. Holt," Emma said. Her voice was flat. Elena came to the window. Douglas Holt was dismounting at the gate, dressed better than a man doing fence work, which meant this was an intentional visit. He tied his horse and came toward the porch with an ease that said he'd come to this property before and considered himself welcome. "Go find your father," Elena said. Emma looked at her. "You want me to, please." Emma went out the back. Elena straightened her hair, smoothed her apron, her mother's voice again, not the words but the tone, and went to the front door. She opened it before he knocked. He stopped. Something in his expression said he'd expected someone else, or no one, or at least a door to knock on. "Miss Navarro," he said. He recovered quickly. She'd give him that. "Mr. Holt!" She kept the door at her back, not blocking it exactly, but not stepping aside. "I was looking for Walker. He's in the field." "I'll wait." "I'll let him know you're here." She did not step aside. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has decided something about a situation and is now annoyed to find the situation more complicated than he'd planned. He glanced past her into the house, a gesture so small she might have missed it, but she didn't miss it. He was looking to see what she was doing in there, what the house looked like, what information the interior of it might give him. "You're still here," he said. Not quite a question. "I am. I'd have thought—" He paused, adjusting what he was about to say. "There must be work back east for a woman with your—" Another pause. "Capabilities." The word landed the way it was intended to, wrapped in something polite on the outside. She'd heard the inflection before. "There's work here," she said pleasantly. Cole appeared around the side of the barn, Emma half a step behind him. Cole's face as he came across the yard was neutral in the specific way of a man who is deciding how much to reveal before he knows what he's dealing with. "Doug," he said, not warmly, but without particular edge either. "Cole." Holt turned from Elena with an ease that said he'd already dismissed her. "I wanted to talk about the south fence line. There's a section running along your lower pasture." "I know the section," Cole said. He came up onto the porch step. He didn't quite stand beside Elena, but close enough that it was a position, not an accident. "There's some erosion on my side that I think is being caused by the drainage from your land," Holt said. He said it like a man making a reasonable, neighborly observation. "I thought we could discuss a solution." "I'll have a look at it," Cole said. "I was thinking we could settle it quicker than that." Holt smiled. "A practiced thing. I've actually been meaning to talk to you about the south pasture anyway. I know you've had some—" He seemed to choose the word carefully. "Financial pressures. I'd be willing to make you a fair offer on that piece, clear up the fence issue, give you some breathing room." Cole was quiet for a moment. Elena kept her eyes on the middle distance, which was not easy. "I'll think about it," Cole said. Holt's smile didn't waver. "Take your time." He touched the brim of his hat, glanced briefly at Elena, not at her face, more generally in passing, and went back to his horse. They watched him ride out. Emma appeared at Cole's elbow. "He wants the south pasture," Emma said. "I know," Cole said. "Because of the water," Emma said. Both adults looked at her. "What?" she said. "I listen." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Cole and Elena sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them and the letter to the water rights lawyer in Pueblo already drafted and folded on the desk. Cole was looking at the letter and Elena was looking at the accounts, and the specific silence between them was different from the silences of the first week. Less careful, less provisional. It had the texture of two people who had stopped testing each other. "He knows we're looking at the south pasture," Cole said. "That's what the fence line story was about. He wanted to see if we'd react." "He doesn't know what we've found," Elena said. "If he did, he'd have moved faster than a conversation about drainage." "How long do we have before he figures it out?" She turned a page in the accounts. "Before we file anything, we have the same amount of time we've always had. Once we file, it becomes public record. So everything needs to be ready before we file." "The letter goes tomorrow?" "Yes." He was quiet, turning his coffee cup. She'd noticed this about him. He processed things physically, small movements, the neck, the hands, while the rest of him stayed still. Margaret Walker had apparently kept this ranch's books and this man's life from sliding sideways for years. And when she died, he'd just kept going, kept the cattle fed and the fences roughly up, and his daughter alive and healthy, and none of those things were small things. She'd been here 3 weeks, and she could see what it had cost him. "What made you stay?" he asked. He wasn't looking at her. Not the general answer, the real one. She thought about it honestly. "I read your wife's ledgers," she said, "the careful ones, from before, and I could see that whoever kept these books, she took them seriously. Like the ranch mattered." She paused. I didn't want to leave something that mattered. He looked up then. Also, she said, Emma didn't give me much choice. Something real crossed his face then. Not the tucked-away almost smile from the first day, but something fuller, unexpected, like a window opening in a room that had been closed for a while. No, he said. She generally doesn't. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the Walker Ranch. The mountains were out there in the dark, as they always were, patient and indifferent and enormous. Inside, two people who hadn't known each other a month ago sat across a kitchen table with cold coffee and a folded letter and a mess of accounts between them. And for the first time in the better part of 3 years, the house felt like it had more than one person trying to keep it standing. Elena turned back to the accounts. She had 3 more pages to get through before she let herself sleep. She worked, and the lantern burned, and the ranch was quiet around her. The letter to the lawyer in Pueblo went out on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, the drought arrived. It didn't announce itself the way storms did. It came in quietly, the way most slow disasters do. A week without rain that became 2 weeks, then 3. The grass going from brown at the tips to brown all the way down, the creek level dropping by inches that added up to feet. Cole stood at the south fence on a morning in late September and looked at the sky the way a man looks at something he can't negotiate with, jaw set, saying nothing. Elena stood beside him. She'd learned by now that Cole Walker's silences weren't emptiness. They were where he did his hardest thinking. She'd learned to let them run. How long can the cattle hold on what's left in the north pasture, she asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4 if I move them to the upper section. He squinted at the horizon. After that, I'd need to buy feed, He stopped. Which isn't possible right now, she finished. Not at the rate from Patterson's mill. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and she walked beside him, her boots still suffering the scrubland, a problem she'd stopped thinking about because there was always a larger problem. Hendersons are feeling it too. Saw Roy Henderson in town yesterday. He said 2 of his wells are down to mud. Sutter Creek, she said. He looked at her. The creek is still running, she said. I checked it yesterday. Lower than it was, but running. If the channel were clear. We don't have the filing done yet. I know. She pushed a strand of hair off her forehead. The wind was hot and dry, and it had been for days. How long does Greer think the filing will take once we have everything from the Pueblo lawyer? He said 2 weeks minimum. Could be a month if Holt contests it. Holt will contest it. Yes, Cole said, with the flat certainty of a man who has accepted something he doesn't like. He will. They reached the barn and he went in to start the morning work. And Elena went back to the house, where Emma was sitting at the kitchen table in front of her schoolwork, with the expression of someone who has decided to tolerate something for the time being. The girl had been watching everything for the past week with those dark, absorbing eyes and saying less than usual, which, for Emma Walker, amounted to a kind of weighted silence. Is it going to be okay? Emma asked. She wasn't looking up from her paper. Elena poured herself coffee. We're working on it. That's not what I asked. Elena looked at her, 8 years old, and she asked questions like a much older person, not to be difficult, but because she genuinely wanted the honest answer rather than the managed one. It was both admirable and exhausting. I don't know yet, Elena said, but I'm not done trying. There's a difference. Emma seemed to consider this. She picked up her pencil and went back to her arithmetic, which was apparently acceptable. Well, the letter from the Pueblo lawyer arrived 9 days after they'd sent theirs. His name was Arthur Delacroix, and his letter was 4 pages of precise, unsentimental legal language that Elena read twice in the office while Cole stood in the doorway. Delacroix's assessment of the 1861 water rights document was unequivocal. It was valid, properly recorded, and had never been legally superseded or transferred. The Walker Ranch held prior claim on Sutter Creek water through the Southern Channel, and that claim predated every other water agreement in the county by at least a decade. He also wrote one sentence that Elena read a third time. The deliberate obstruction of a legally established water channel constitutes, under current territorial statute, both a civil wrong and a potential criminal matter, the severity of which depends on the demonstrable intent and the harm caused. She looked up at Cole. He's saying we can go after Holt for the blockage itself, she said, not just the water rights, for what he did to the channel. Cole came into the office and took the letter. He read it himself, slowly, and she watched his face while he did it. There was no satisfaction in his expression, which she'd half expected, and no anger in the way anger usually showed itself. What she saw instead was something quieter and more complicated. A man who had lived next to this person for years, who had taken his advice about a bank loan, who had perhaps considered him something close to a neighbor, arriving at the full shape of what had been done to him. He was going to take all of it, Cole said. He wasn't speaking to her exactly. The loan default would have given the bank the eastern pasture. With the water blocked, the south pasture would have been worthless to me and worth everything to him. 2-3 years from now, I'd have been looking at selling the rest just to survive. That's how I read it. He set the letter down on the desk. He put both hands flat on the surface for a moment, like he needed something solid. What do we do first? He asked. We document the channel blockage before anything else. Physical evidence? Dated. Then we take everything to Greer. Delacroix's letter, the original filing, the survey maps, the bank loan documents. All of it at once. She pulled her notes from the stack she'd been building. Greer needs to file the water rights claim, and separately, or simultaneously, he'll know better, file a complaint about the channel obstruction. If we file both things at the same time, Holt can't stop one without the other becoming more visible. Cole looked at her notes. You've been planning this. Since last week. He was quiet for a moment. Elena. She looked up. I need to ask you something directly, he said. It had the tone of something he'd been sitting with for a while. What Holt did to you. When you arrived. When he sent you away. Does any part of this... He paused, choosing. Is any part of what you're doing here about that? It was a fair question. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. She took a breath. Some part of it probably, she said. I won't pretend I don't have feelings about how I was treated, but Cole... She tapped the documents on the desk. This is real. The water rights are real. The channel obstruction is real. What he was doing to your ranch is real. Even if I had no feelings about Douglas Holt at all, this would be worth fighting. He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded once. All right, he said. Let's go see Greer. Phew. They went to Greer's office on a Thursday morning, and Elena had been right about one thing and wrong about one thing. She'd been right that Greer would take it seriously once he saw the Delacroix letter and the original water rights filing. He read everything carefully, asked 4 or 5 pointed questions, and said that yes, there was a case here, a real one. What she'd been wrong about was the timeline. I can file the water rights claim next week, Greer said. He was a thin man in his 50s with a carefully trimmed gray mustache and reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. But the channel obstruction complaint is more complicated. I need someone to survey the blockage and document it officially. The county surveyor is... He checked something on his desk. He's out on a job in the northern county until next month. Next month, Cole said. There may be someone in Pueblo who could come sooner, at a cost. Cole looked at the desk. Elena looked at Cole. The cost of bringing a surveyor from Pueblo was something she'd already calculated, roughly, in her head. It was possible. Barely. It would leave them almost nothing for feed if the drought held another 6 weeks. She didn't say any of this out loud in Greer's office. They could talk about it in the wagon on the way home. File the water rights claim now, Elena said to Greer. We'll handle the surveyor. Cole looked at her. She met his eyes. File it this week, she said, before Holt has any reason to think we're moving. Greer pushed his glasses up and began writing. They were 2 days out from Greer's filing when the first thing happened. Elena was hanging laundry at the side of the house in the late afternoon when a rider came up the road fast. She recognized him as one of the men who worked for Holt. She'd seen him in town twice, and he didn't stop at the gate but kept going, which meant he wasn't coming to see Cole. She watched him go north up the road toward the Henderson property. She finished the laundry. She thought about it. She was in the kitchen starting supper when Cole came in from the field, with his face arranged in the particular way that meant something had happened. Roy Henderson came by, he said. He stood in the doorway. Holt offered to buy his ranch, today, out of nowhere. She set down what she was holding. Roy Henderson's land is between yours and Holt's north fence. Yes. If Henderson sells, Holt would own a continuous piece from his place to my eastern fence line. Cole came inside and sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. Roy told him he'd think about it. Roy's in bad shape with the drought. He might not be able to say no. Elena sat down across from him. Emma was outside somewhere, thankfully. He knows, she said, or he suspects. He's trying to rearrange the pieces before we can file. Greer filed this morning. Then Holt will know by end of week when it's posted at the county office. She pressed her hands flat on the table, thinking. He's going to move fast now. What does he have? He has money, he has connections at the bank, and he has... She stopped. What? She thought about how Holt had looked at her on the porch that day, the practiced ease of a man who was used to being the person who defined the terms. He has the story he's been telling about me, she said, about why I'm here. He sent me away publicly and now I'm living on your ranch. That's the story he's going to push. Cole was very still. He'll say I came here with an agenda, she said, that I have reasons to cause him trouble, that anything I found in the books is something I could have arranged, that I'm not trustworthy. She said it flatly, mapping it out the way she'd map a column of figures. She'd thought about it already. She'd thought about it in the dark the previous 2 nights, actually. He'll go to people in town before we can. He'll make sure the story about me gets there first. People know you now, Cole said. You've been here 2 months. I've been here 2 months, and I'm a single woman living on a widower's property, and I came from somewhere else, and I'm... She stopped. She didn't need to finish it. He looked at her steadily. Say it. I'm what people already have a story about before they know anything else about me, she said. Holt is going to use that. He doesn't have to say anything untrue. He just has to let people's assumptions do the work. A silence. Outside, she could hear Emma's voice somewhere near the barn, talking to the horses the way she did, a running commentary on the world as Emma Walker understood it. I should tell you, Cole said. He was looking at the table. Mrs. Aldrich stopped me on the street Tuesday, asked me how things were out at the ranch, how Emma was doing. He paused. She asked if I thought it was appropriate. The arrangement. Elena said nothing. I told her it was none of her business, Cole said. He said it simply, like a fact, not like a statement he'd weighed or was proud of. But she'll keep talking. She will. Elena pulled herself back to what was actionable. It doesn't matter. We just have to move faster than the gossip. How? She thought for a moment. The Hendersons. If Roy Henderson doesn't sell to Holt, if we can convince him to hold on a little longer, that buys us time, can you talk to him? I can try. Tell him about the water rights filing. Tell him what the claim means for every ranch in this valley, his included. If the channel opens, the drought becomes survivable. Holt has been the only one with full water access because he blocked the channel. That's not just your problem. It's every rancher who's downstream. Cole was looking at her with something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite the window opening thing from the other night. Something more like a man recognizing the full dimensions of what was standing in front of him. You thought about all of this already, he said. I think about it constantly, she said honestly. I can't turn it off. He went to see Henderson the next day. Elena stayed at the ranch and worked, and she was in the office going through the final copies of the documentation Greer would need for the obstruction complaint when she heard a horse in the yard and looked out the window and saw that it wasn't Cole. It was 2 men she didn't recognize. They dismounted at the gate and came toward the house without particular hurry, which was either reassuring or its opposite. She went to the front door. Emma was in her room. She'd sent her up after the noon meal under the pretense of schoolwork. She opened the door. The men were ranch hands by the look of them. Worn clothes, the specific posture of people who spent most of their lives outdoors. One of them was younger, maybe 25, with a sunburned face and the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who had been told to do something he wasn't sure about. The older one had a more settled quality that she trusted less. Afternoon, the older one said. Looking for Walker. He's not here. When's he back? I don't know. This was the truth. The older man looked at her, not unkindly exactly, but with a deliberate quality, taking his time. You the woman who's been going through his papers? She kept her face still. I work for Mr. Walker. Can I give him a message? You can tell him that Mr. Holt would like to talk about the filing. A pause. He'd like to talk soon. I'll tell him. The older man nodded slowly. He glanced past her into the house in exactly the way Holt had done. That quick reading of the interior, the assessment, then he looked back at her. You know, he said, I've got to say, you've got nerve, I'll give you that. Coming into somebody else's business the way you have. She said nothing. Just speaking plain, he said, not aggressively, almost conversationally. Folks in town have been wondering what your angle is. Can't say I blame them. Thank you for the message, Elena said. She held the door. He took a moment longer than necessary, then turned and walked back to his horse. The younger one followed without having said anything at all. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with her back against the wood and took one slow breath, then another. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs. I heard, Emma said. I know you did. Are you scared? Elena looked up at her. A little, she said. This was true. There was no particular reason to lie to Emma about it, and Elena had noticed that honesty with the girl generally returned more trust than protection did. Emma came down the stairs and stood on the bottom step, which put her almost at eye level with Elena. She studied Elena's face with that characteristic open attention. Mama was scared sometimes, Emma said. She said being scared was just your body telling you the thing mattered. Elena looked at her for a moment. She sounds like she was smart. She was. Emma said it without self-pity, without performance, just as information. You're smart too. It's different, but it's the same kind. Elena didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded once and went back to the office. She sat down in Margaret Walker's chair and picked up the document she'd been working on and tried to focus. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed this and kept working anyway. Cole came back from the Henderson place in the late afternoon, and she could read the news before he said it from the set of his shoulders as he came through the door. Roy's selling, he said. To Holt? Not yet. He said he'd give it 2 weeks. Cole hung his hat on the peg. I told him about the filing, about the water rights. He listened. He wants to believe it, but he's got 3 kids and a wife and his wells are dry. He sat down. 2 weeks is what we have. Elena set down her pen. She'd been calculating already, in the back of her mind, what 2 weeks left them. The county surveyor is still out until next month, she said. I know. Can we document the channel ourselves? Photographs if we can get a camera, witnesses who will swear to what they see, measurements? She leaned forward. It won't be as clean as a professional survey, but if we can document enough that Greer can work with it while we wait for the official survey, that would involve people, Cole said. People who'd need to see the blockage and be willing to say so publicly, in front of Holt. Yes. He rubbed the back of his neck. Hennessy might. He's not afraid of Holt, and he's got no dealings with him. He thought. Carver, over on the east side. He's been feeling the drought hard. If he understood what the water rights filing means for his land, that's 2, Elena said. We need at least 3. I can think of others. He looked at her. You'd have to come. You're the one who found it. You know the documents. I know. People will talk more. They're already talking, she said. At some point, you stop making decisions based on what people might say and start making them based on what's actually in front of you. He was quiet. Then, Holt's men came by. I know, they were here this afternoon. He looked up sharply. What did they want? To tell you Holt wants to talk about the filing, and to look at the house and remind me that people in town have questions about my character. She said it evenly. The usual. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, but something with more heat in it than she usually saw from him. They said that to you directly. The older one did. It was politely put. Elena. Cole. She met his eyes. I've been hearing variations of that my whole life. I can handle it. What I need you focused on is the next 2 weeks, not what some ranch hand said on my front porch. He held her gaze. She could see him working through something. She'd learned enough about him to know that he had strong feelings he kept in relatively tight management, that they surfaced in the things he did rather than the things he said. All right, he said, after a moment. We go to the channel Saturday. I'll talk to Hennessy and Carver tomorrow. They went on Saturday morning, 6 of them in total. Cole, Elena, Hennessy, Carver, and two of the Carver boys who were old enough to be useful and had brought between them a camera that worked intermittently and a set of measuring tools from their father's barn. The morning was overcast, which helped with the heat, and they reached the southern channel by mid-morning. Elena walked them through what she'd found. The original survey map spread on the ground, the lines of the channel running from the creek, the filled section where the natural flow had been interrupted. Hennessy crouched at the edge of the fill and dug at it with a pocket knife and pulled up material that was clearly not native to the area, packed gravel and clay mixed with what looked like quarried stone, the kind of material you brought in deliberately. "That's not erosion," Hennessy said. He looked at Cole. "No," Cole said. The Carver boy with the camera managed to get 5 photographs before the mechanism jammed, which was 3 more than Elena had dared hope for. They measured the fill's dimensions and she wrote everything down in the notebook she'd brought, and the 2 Carver boys dug a test hole at the edge of the fill to establish its depth. And Carver himself stood at the dry channel bed looking downstream toward where Sutter Creek ran and said, very quietly, that his own south pasture was 200 yards that direction. "If this opened up," Carver said. "It's your water too," Elena told him. "The 1861 filing gives first claim to the Walker Ranch, but it doesn't restrict other ranchers from secondary access. If Holt hadn't blocked this, you'd have had a drought supply all summer." Carver looked at her for a long moment. He was a deliberate man, slower to move than Hennessy, the kind of person who needed to think something through all the way before he committed to it. "I'll sign whatever Greer puts in front of me," he said. Hennessy clapped him on the shoulder. "About time somebody made that man answer for himself." Elena wrote down their names as witnesses in the notebook and had each of them sign it before they left the channel. It wasn't a deposition. It wasn't a legal survey. It was 6 people's names and a set of measurements and 5 photographs if the camera had actually captured anything, and it was going to have to be enough for now. On the walk back, Hennessy fell into step beside her. "You know he's not going to take this lying down," Hennessy said. He wasn't whispering. It was just a straightforward statement. "I know. He's got money and connections at the county level, and he's—" Hennessy seemed to think about how to say it. "He doesn't like losing. He especially doesn't like being seen to lose." "I understand that. What I'm saying is it might get ugly." She looked at him. "Has it been pretty so far?" Hennessy looked surprised for a moment, and then he laughed. A genuine one, the kind that startles out of a person. "No," he said. "Can't say it has." It started the following Monday. She went to town for the supply order, and Mrs. Aldrich was on the front step of the dry goods as she passed, talking to 2 other women Elena recognized by sight, and the conversation paused in the particular way that said she was what they'd been discussing. At the feed counter, Pete was polite but avoided meeting her eyes, and she understood when she overheard someone in the back saying something about the Walker woman and her schemes, that the story had begun to circulate in the form Holt had apparently arranged for it. She picked up the supply order and started back toward the wagon. Someone called her name from across the street. She turned. It was Garrity from the bank. He was standing outside his building with his jacket buttoned, which seemed formal for the sidewalk, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been told to deliver a message and is slightly uncomfortable about it. "Miss Navarro," he said, "I wonder if you might come in. I'd like to discuss the Walker account." She crossed the street. She walked in. She sat in the chair across his desk that was for customers, and he sat behind the desk, and he folded his hands on the surface and told her, in the measured language of a banker trying to sound neutral, that the loan's refinancing period was approaching and that the bank had reason to believe the Walker property's value had been overstated in the original assessment. "Reason to believe based on what?" she asked. "An independent review." "Commissioned by whom?" He paused. "The bank's board." She looked at him. He looked at his folded hands. Garrity was not, she had decided some weeks ago, a truly bad man. He was a man who did what the most powerful person in the room expected, which amounted to the same thing in practice, but was a different problem to solve. "Mr. Garrity," she said, "when the water rights filing is fully processed, which it will be, the Walker property's value is going to change substantially. I'd encourage the bank to wait before making any assessments it might need to revise." He didn't answer. "I'd also," she said quietly, Encourage the bank to be careful about who it's taking instructions from. When this is settled, people are going to remember who did what. She stood up, thanked him for his time, and left. Her hands were steadier than they'd been on Thursday. She climbed into the wagon, unwrapped the reins, and headed back toward the Walker Ranch. The mountains were ahead of her to the west, the same as always. The sky above them had the hard, pale color of a prolonged drought. The creek was lower than it had been last week, she knew. She had perhaps 10 days before Roy Henderson sold his land, and Holt owned the piece between the Walker Ranch and his own property. She had a set of witness signatures and 5 photographs that might or might not have developed. She had a water rights filing that was legally sound, and a channel obstruction that Greer was still building the complaint around, and an 18-month loan adjustment that was going to hit in 30 days if they couldn't demonstrate to the bank that the collateral value of the property had changed. She had, in total, a situation that a reasonable person might look at and call unwinnable. She clicked the reins and drove back toward the ranch. She had not come 1,500 miles to be reasonable about it. The photographs developed, all 5 of them. Cole brought them back from the daguerreotype man in Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon, and Elena spread them on the kitchen table and stood over them with her hands flat on the wood, looking. They weren't perfect. 2 were slightly blurred at the edges. One showed Hennessy's boot in the foreground in a way that obscured part of the fill, but they were clear enough. You could see the channel. You could see the material packed into its upper end. You could see, in the sharpest photograph, the line where the natural creek bed stopped and the obstruction began, the difference in soil color and composition plain even in black and white. "These will hold up," she said. Cole stood beside her. He'd been quiet on the drive back from town. The particular quiet she'd learned to read as him processing something he wasn't ready to say yet. "Greer thinks we can request an emergency hearing," he said, "given the drought conditions and the loan timeline. There's a provision in territorial water law for expedited review when a documented obstruction is causing active harm." He paused. "Delacroix mentioned it in his second letter. I read it again last night." She looked up. "When did you read it?" "Couldn't sleep." She looked back at the photographs. "An emergency hearing means Holt gets notified immediately. He'll have time to prepare." "Yes." "He'll bring a lawyer from Denver, someone better than Greer." "Probably." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "How much time between notification and the hearing?" "Greer said 10 days minimum. Could be 2 weeks." 10 days. Roy Henderson's 2-week window was already at day 6. She did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way she always did. It was almost involuntary at this point, numbers running in the background of everything like a current she couldn't shut off. "We need Henderson to hold," she said. "I know." "Can you go back to him with the photographs this time? Let him see what we have." Cole picked up the clearest photograph, the one showing the channel fill in sharp detail, and looked at it for a long moment. "Roy Henderson's a stubborn man," he said, "but he's fair. If he sees this, he'll understand what Holt did to all of them." He set the photograph down. "I'll go tomorrow." Emma had been sitting on the stairs, which was her preferred location for conversations she wasn't supposed to be part of. Elena had long since stopped being surprised by it. "Mr. Henderson has a daughter in my class," Emma said from the stairs. "Her name is Clara. She told me they haven't had water in the South well for 3 weeks. Cole turned to look at her with the expression of a man who has made peace with having no private conversations in his own home. "Emma, I'm just saying." Elena looked at the photographs again. She looked at the witness signatures in her notebook, 7 now because Carver had brought his eldest son back to sign separately. She thought about Garrity at the bank and his carefully neutral face and the way he'd looked at his folded hands when she'd asked who commissioned the property review. She thought about the story Holt had put into circulation about her, had felt it these past 2 weeks, in the way conversations shifted when she walked into rooms, in the careful distance some people kept, in the questions nobody asked directly but whose shape she could see in their silences. The story wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It just needed to make people uncertain about her, to frame everything she'd found and everything she was doing as motivated by something personal and unreliable. It was the most efficient kind of damage because it didn't require a lie, just a particular arrangement of the truth. The woman Holt had rejected was now living on a neighboring rancher's property and making claims that would cause Holt significant trouble. She'd thought about this enough that she'd stopped letting herself think about it further because it didn't change anything actionable. What it came down to was simple. Either the documents were real or they weren't, and they were. Cole came back from the Henderson place the following afternoon with Roy Henderson himself, which was not what she'd expected. She came out onto the porch when she heard the two horses coming up the road and found Henderson climbing down from his saddle, a big, weathered man in his late 40s with a beard he'd been neglecting and the look of someone who hadn't slept consistently in weeks. He had the photographs in his hand. Cole had apparently shown them to him on the ride. "Miss Navarro," Henderson said. He said it directly, without preamble, and he was looking at her the way men sometimes looked at her when they'd already decided something and wanted to see if it matched. "Cole says you're the one who found the water rights document." "Yes?" "And you figured out what Holt had done." "The documents showed it. I just read them." He looked at the photographs again. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that is both completely expected and still somehow worse than he'd prepared himself for. "My grandfather drank from Sutter Creek," Henderson said. He said it to nobody in particular. "My father built that south pasture fence with the understanding that the creek would water it. When it dropped off..." He stopped. "I thought it was the land. Thought we'd just used it out somehow. I never thought..." "He blocked it 4 years ago," Elena said quietly. "Maybe 5. The vegetation on the fill is established enough to make the exact date hard to pinpoint, but Greer will be able to establish a range with the photographs and the soil composition." Henderson looked up at her. "You think you can win this?" "I think the law is on our side," she said, "which isn't the same thing, always, but it matters here. The 1861 filing is airtight. Delacroix, the Pueblo lawyer, said he'd never seen a cleaner water rights claim. Holt's obstruction is documented. The loan Cole was sold was structured to push him toward default once his property dropped in value. All of that is provable." "Holt has money," Henderson said. "He does. And friends at the county level." "He has some." She held his gaze. "But the hearing will be in front of a territorial judge, not county. Greer is requesting it at the territorial level specifically because of the water law precedent involved. Holt's county connections are less useful there." Henderson looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him without particular expression, the steady, unsaid communication of two men who'd known each other for years. "What do you need from me?" Henderson asked. "Your signature on an affidavit about the change in your water access over the past 4 to 5 years, Elena said. "Dates, observations, what your south well looked like before, and what it looks like now. Greer will write it up. You just need to swear to what you've seen." "That I can do?" He rolled the photographs and handed them back to Cole. "I'll hold the sale. For now." He looked at Elena one more time, that same direct assessment, and then he nodded once and got back on his horse and rode out. Cole came up onto the porch beside her. "That's 3 ranchers with affidavits," she said. "Hennessy, Carver, Henderson." "It's enough," Cole said. "It's enough to file," she said. "Whether it's enough to win is something else." Greer filed the emergency hearing request on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Holt knew. Elena knew he knew because one of Carver's boys rode over Saturday morning to tell them that Holt had been to see Carver the previous evening, showed up at supper time, which she imagined was intentional, the disruption of a family meal as a show of force. He'd been polite, Carver's boy said. Very polite. He'd asked Carver if he was sure he understood what he was signing, whether he'd gotten independent legal advice, whether he was aware that siding against a neighbor over documents found by a woman of uncertain background and motive was a significant risk. Carver had told him to get off his property. The boy delivered this with some satisfaction. Elena thanked him and gave him coffee and sent him home. She spent the rest of Saturday preparing the final documentation package for Greer, organized, cross-referenced, with a summary sheet she'd written that laid out the chain of evidence clearly enough that anyone could follow it without a legal background. She'd done this deliberately. Not for Greer, who was capable of organizing his own case, but because she wanted something that could be read aloud in a room and understood. Cole found her at this desk late Saturday evening and stood in the doorway the way he sometimes did, not interrupting, just present. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." "Elena." She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he had the look he sometimes got in the evenings when Emma was asleep and the ranch was quiet, less managed, closer to whatever he actually was underneath the daily performance of keeping things running. "I've been thinking about what happens after," he said. She waited. "If we win the hearing, clear the loan, open the channel." He paused. "Things are going to be different around here." "Better," she said. "Yes, better." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want you to think—" He stopped. Started again, which was unusual for him. "I don't want you thinking that once things are stable again, there isn't a place for you here. I know you came here for something else. I know Caldwell wasn't your plan." She looked at him steadily. "Are you trying to tell me I can stay, or trying to tell me I don't have to?" "Both," he said honestly. "I didn't want you not knowing the option existed." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at her papers. Her chest felt like something was shifting in it, some furniture being rearranged. "Let me get through the hearing first," she said. "Then we can talk about what comes next." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's fair." He went upstairs. She turned back to her papers and worked until the lantern needed filling. The hearing was set for a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the filing, in the territorial courthouse in the county seat, which was a half-day's ride from Caldwell. Greer had arranged for an afternoon session with Judge Aldous Crane, who Delacroix had confirmed in a brief letter was known for running tight hearings and had no particular relationship with the Caldwell business community, which was the closest thing to reassurance any of them were going to get. They arrived in 2 wagons, Cole and Elena and Greer in one, with the documentation box. Hennessy, Carver, and Henderson in the other, suited up in various states of formality. Hennessy had found a jacket somewhere that fit him approximately. Carver had borrowed his son-in-law's good hat. Henderson had shaved, which represented real effort. Holt arrived with a lawyer from Denver named Prescott, a slim, composed man in his 40s who wore his suit with the ease of someone born to it and carried a leather case that looked expensive. Holt himself was dressed simply, which Elena suspected was also a calculation. He looked like a working rancher, a reasonable man, a pillar. She recognized the performance because she'd watched him perform it on Cole's front porch. He did not look at her when he came in. This was also deliberate. Judge Crane was a heavy-set man in his 60s with the deep patience of someone who had spent decades listening to people argue about land and water and money. He opened the hearing without ceremony, stated the matter before the court in 2 sentences, and told both parties they had until 4 in the afternoon to make their cases. Prescott went first, which Greer had anticipated. His argument was polished and moved quickly. The 1861 water rights document was historical, but had been dormant so long as to constitute abandonment under territorial precedent. The alleged channel obstruction was, at best, a drainage management decision made on property Holt legally owned. The Walker Ranch's financial difficulties predated any involvement by Holt and were the result of mismanagement following the death of the property owner's wife. The woman who had produced the documentation at issue had personal grievances against Mr. Holt and was not an impartial party. He said this last part carefully, looking not at Elena but at the judge, and the room was very quiet for a moment. Judge Crane wrote something down. He looked up. "The court will evaluate the documents on their merits," he said, in a tone that did not invite further comment on the point. Prescott sat down. Greer stood up. Greer was not a flashy lawyer. Elena had understood this from the first meeting. What he was, she'd come to realize, was thorough. And thorough, in this particular case, was better than flashy because what they had was not a complicated argument. It was a simple argument supported by a substantial amount of organized evidence, and Greer walked through it piece by piece with the steady persistence of a man who trusts the material. The 1861 filing, the survey maps, original and current, the photographs of the obstruction, the soil composition analysis that Greer had managed to get from a geology professor in Pueblo who'd agreed, for a modest fee, to examine the fill material and confirm it was quarried stone transported to the site deliberately. The affidavits from Hennessy, Carver, and Henderson, each describing the change in their water access over the past several years. The loan documents from First National, with Delacroix's written analysis of the refinancing terms attached. And then Greer called Elena. She hadn't known he was going to do this. He hadn't told her. She looked at him for a moment when he said her name. Just a moment. And then she stood up and went to the chair beside the judge's desk that served as the witness position. Prescott objected on the grounds that she was a party of interest. Judge Crane noted the objection and overruled it with one word. Greer asked her to describe, in plain terms, what she had found in the Walker account books and how she had found it. She described it. She kept her voice level and used plain language and did not editorialize. She explained the water rights document and where it had been and what it said. She explained the loan structure and what the refinancing clause meant in practice. She explained what she had found at the channel and why the fill material was inconsistent with natural erosion. She spoke for 11 minutes by the clock on the courtroom wall. When she was done, Prescott stood for cross-examination. He was good. She'd known he would be. He asked about her background, her qualifications, her reason for being in Caldwell. He asked whether she had any legal training. He asked whether she had ever been compensated for bookkeeping work in a professional capacity prior to her employment at the Walker Ranch. He asked, carefully, neutrally, without any particular inflection, whether it was true that she had originally come to Caldwell in connection with Mr. Holt. Yes, she said, and the arrangement fell through. Mr. Holt declined to honor it when I arrived, she said. She said it factually. She did not look at Holt. So you found employment with the Walker Ranch shortly after. Mr. Walker offered me temporary work. I accepted. And in the course of that work, you discovered evidence of wrongdoing by the man who had previously rejected you. She held Prescott's gaze. In the course of that work, I found documents that had been in those files for years. The documents said what they said regardless of who read them. She paused. If Mr. Walker had found them himself, they would have said the same things. Prescott looked at her for a beat. He was deciding whether to push it further. She could see the calculation. No further questions, he said, and sat down. The room was quiet. Judge Crane was writing. Cole was looking at the table in front of him, jaw working slightly. Henderson, in the row behind, had his hands on his knees and was looking at the floor. Holt was looking at Elena. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly since he'd walked into the room. She met his gaze and held it and said nothing with her face. She held it long enough that he was the one who looked away. Judge Crane took 1 hour and 20 minutes. They waited in the corridor outside the courtroom. Cole and Elena on one bench, Hennessy and Henderson and Carver ranged along the wall. Greer paced, which was apparently how he worked off the waiting. Nobody talked much. Hennessy produced a piece of hard candy from somewhere and offered it around. Only Emma, who had insisted on coming and whom Cole had eventually stopped arguing with, accepted it. She sat beside Elena on the bench and swung her legs, which didn't reach the floor. "What are they thinking about in there?" Emma asked. "The evidence," Elena said. "How long does it take to think?" "Apparently 1 hour and 20 minutes. Emma leaned her head against Elena's shoulder, which she'd started doing recently. Not dramatically, not making a thing of it, just choosing that proximity the way she chose other things, because it made sense to her. Elena had stopped noticing it consciously and had started just letting it be there. The slight warm weight of the girl's head, the smell of her hair that still had the morning's dust in it. Cole was watching them from the other end of the bench. Elena looked over and caught him doing it. He didn't look away. He just looked, plainly, the way he did most things when he wasn't trying to manage what showed on his face. The door opened. Greer stopped pacing. They filed back in. Judge Crane set his papers on the desk with the specific neatness of a man who thinks order matters and took off his reading glasses and put them in his breast pocket. "The court finds," he said, "that the 1861 water rights filing is valid, active, and has never been legally abandoned under any applicable territorial provision. The Walker Ranch holds prior claim to water access via the southern Sutter Creek Channel." Prescott's pen was moving. Holt's face was still. "The court further finds," Crane continued, "that the obstruction of said channel constitutes a demonstrable civil wrong under territorial water statute and caused measurable harm to the Walker property and indirectly to neighboring properties whose water access was affected. The respondent is ordered to fund the removal of the obstruction within 30 days. Cole was very still beside Elena. She could feel it without looking. "Regarding the bank loan," Crane said, and paused to find the relevant page in his notes, "the court does not have jurisdiction over the loan terms themselves, but the finding on property value, which is substantially increased by the restoration of water rights, will be entered into the county property record and made available to the First National Bank of Caldwell for the purposes of their assessment." He looked at Garrity, who had come to the hearing and was sitting in the back row. The bank will want to review its position. Garrity was already looking at his hands. This court's ruling on the criminal matter of deliberate obstruction will be forwarded to the territorial prosecutor's office for their determination of whether to pursue charges. He looked at Prescott. Counsel will want to advise his client accordingly. Prescott leaned over and said something quietly into Holt's ear. Holt sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and for the first time since Elena had seen him on that train platform, he looked like a man in a situation he couldn't simply make a calculation about and step away from. Crane put his glasses back on. "That's my ruling. We're adjourned." The room started moving. Greer turned around with an expression of barely contained relief. Not triumphant, just the look of a man who'd done his job and it had held up. Henderson exhaled something that wasn't quite a word. Hennessy hit Carver on the arm. Cole stood up. Elena stood up beside him. He was looking at the front of the room, at the place where the judge had been, at nothing in particular. She could see what was happening in his face, all the things he'd been holding in compression for months, the loan and the drought, and the slow dismantling of what he'd built, everything he'd held together by stubbornness and will without anyone to share it with. She could see it shifting now, not releasing all at once, but beginning to. He turned and looked at her. "We're going to be all right," he said. He said it like he wasn't sure he'd ever believed that before. "I told you," she said. "I told you it wasn't as bad as you thought. You told me the books weren't as bad." "The books are the ranch," she said. "Same thing." Something about this made him laugh. A short, rough sound, not polished, caught off guard by itself. She didn't know she'd been waiting to hear that until she heard it. Emma appeared between them from nowhere, which was her particular gift. "Did we win?" she asked. "Yes," Cole said. Emma considered this. "Good," she said, and went to find Hennessy, presumably to tell him. They were the last ones out of the building. Holt passed them in the corridor on his way out, Prescott at his shoulder, and there was a moment where they were in the same hallway and there was nowhere else to be. Holt stopped. Prescott didn't, and then adjusted when he realized his client had stopped. Holt looked at Cole. "I'll contest the channel order," he said. It wasn't a threat exactly, more like a man telling himself something out loud. "You can try," Cole said. Holt looked at Elena then. He looked at her the way he had on the platform all those months ago. That same calculation, that same reading of sum and parts. But something was different now. Some foundational assumption that had been in his face that day was absent. "You did this," he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was almost just an acknowledgement of something he needed to understand. "The documents did it," she said. "They were there the whole time." He stood for a moment. Then he walked out, and Prescott followed, and they were gone. The ride back to Caldwell took the better part of the afternoon, and by the time the two wagons came up the road toward the ranch, the sun was low and orange and hitting the mountains straight on, turning them colors that didn't have real names. Elena had barely spoken since they left the courthouse. Cole had barely spoken since they left the courthouse. Between them on the wagon seat, Emma had talked enough for all three of them and had eventually talked herself into a half-sleep, leaning against Elena's arm. Cole drove. The horses knew the road. "Carver's going to tell everyone," Cole said. It wasn't a concern, just an observation. "By Thursday, everyone in the valley will know what happened." "I know. It won't make everything easy. People will adjust their positions. Some of them quickly, some of them not at all." "I know that too." He glanced at her. The light was doing something to the side of his face that she didn't look at too directly. "You're not thinking about leaving," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I haven't decided anything," she said. "I told you. After the hearing." "The hearing's over." "I know." She looked out at the land going past, the brown grass, the fence lines, the mountains ahead. "I'm still thinking." He didn't push it. That was one of the things about him. He asked questions directly and then left them alone. She'd come to value that more than she could easily say. They came around the last bend in the road, and the Walker Ranch came into view. The farmhouse with the covered porch, the barn that still needed paint, the fence lines running out in both directions. The kitchen garden had struggled all summer, but there was still something green in it, stubbornly, at the far end. It looked like what it was. Not perfect. Not easy. a place that had been through things and was still standing. Cole pulled the horses to a stop at the gate. Emma stirred against Elena's arm and looked up with the half-aware expression of someone returning from somewhere. "Are we home?" Emma asked. Cole looked at the house. He looked at Elena. "Yes," he said, "we're home." Elena looked at the house too, at the light in the windows that they'd left burning when they'd gone out that morning, and she didn't say anything. She just sat with Emma warm against her arm, and the mountains behind them and the evening coming down over the Walker Ranch like something that had been deciding to settle for a long time. She was still thinking, but she already knew. She already knew, but knowing and saying were different things, and Elena Navarro had spent enough of her life being careful about the distance between them. The days after the hearing had their own particular texture. Not the relief she'd expected exactly, but something more complicated. Relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the strange flatness that comes after you've been running hard towards something for weeks, and the thing finally stops moving. She'd lain awake the first 2 nights after the courthouse not from worry, for the first time in months, but from the unfamiliar quiet of not having a problem to solve in the dark. The channel clearance crew arrived from Holt's property on the 28th day of the 30 the judge had allowed, which was as late as it could possibly be without being in violation, and Elena suspected this was deliberate, a last small assertion of control from a man who had very few left. She watched from the south fence as 4 men with shovels and a horse-drawn scraper spent the better part of 2 days removing the fill from the upper channel, and she did not take satisfaction in watching it exactly, but she did not look away either. Cole stood beside her for part of the first morning. He didn't say much. At one point he said, "My father built that channel in 1858, and she said, 'I know,' because she'd read it in the oldest of the ledgers, a notation in a hand that predated Margaret's, a line about the cost of stone and labor. He didn't say anything else about it, but he stayed there an hour longer than he needed to." The water came back into the channel on the second afternoon. It didn't come back dramatically. It seeped first, then trickled, then ran, the way water does when it finds a way through, unhurried and without any particular concern for how long it had been blocked. Elena stood at the channel's lower end and watched it run, and thought about her mother, who had traveled a very long way to find something real and had found it and built it, and then left earlier than anyone had expected, and about whether that counted as a life that worked out. She thought it did. She thought it did more than she used to. The First National Bank sent a letter the second week of October. Garrity had written it himself, which she suspected Holt had not told him to do, and which represented some private decision on Garrity's part to put something on record. The letter acknowledged the revised property assessment, substantially higher with the water rights restoration, and offered to restructure the loan under new terms that were, while not generous, at least honest. The secondary claim on the eastern pasture was released. Cole read the letter twice, then handed it to Elena without comment. She read it. "He structured the new terms himself," she said. "Garrity did. This isn't bank boilerplate." "No? He's covering himself. But he's doing it in a way that actually helps you." Cole leaned back in the chair. "Should I take it?" She thought about it. "Talk to Greer first. Get him to look at the language. But yes, if Greer says the terms are clean, take it." She set the letter down. "It's not the worst outcome for Garrity. He survives this. He keeps his position. He probably learned something." She paused. "Maybe. People like Garrity learn when it costs them not to," Cole said, without particular bitterness, just as observation. "That's most people," she said. He looked at her across the desk. "Not you." She let that sit for a moment. "I've had practice," she said. "Being on the side where the cost comes, no matter what you do, teaches you to learn differently." Greer approved the loan restructuring with 3 minor amendments that Garrity accepted without argument, which told its own story. The papers were signed on a Thursday morning in Greer's office, and on the way back through town, Elena and Cole stopped at the supply store, and she noticed that Pete at the counter was more straightforwardly friendly than he'd been in months, and that the woman who'd been standing with Mrs. Aldrich outside the dry goods the day Aldrich had watched her pass, a woman named Ruth Carver, she'd since learned daughter-in-law to the rancher who'd signed her affidavit, stopped her on the sidewalk and introduced herself properly and said she hoped they'd see Elena at the church social in November. Elena said she'd try to make it, She didn't say it warmly or coldly. She said it the way she'd learned to say things to people whose positions had recently shifted, which was without making it too easy and without making it too hard. Cole, walking beside her, said nothing until they were in the wagon heading home. "You're not going to forgive them all quickly," he said. "No. But you're not going to hold it against them forever either." She watched the road. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Some of them, probably. The ones who were just scared, who didn't know better. Mrs. Aldrich." She stopped. "Mrs. Aldrich knew better." "Yes," Cole said. "She generally does." "Those are different things, being scared and being mean. I can work with scared." He glanced at her sideways. "Is that what you think happened with most of them?" She thought about the way the town had moved around her in those weeks. The careful distances, the shifted conversations. She thought about how she'd looked to them, a stranger, a woman without established connections, living with a widower, making claims that inconvenienced a man they'd known for 20 years. She thought about how she would have read that situation if she'd been them and hadn't known herself. "Most of them," she said. "Not all." He nodded. He didn't try to argue either direction, which was right. Emma had her own process, which was less complicated and more direct than the adults around her. In the weeks after the hearing, Emma had begun arriving home from school with reports on the social situation that were delivered with the dispassion of a field researcher and the thoroughness of someone who considered information important, regardless of how it made you feel. Clara Henderson had said her father said Elena was the bravest woman in the county. A boy named Thomas Aldrich, Mrs. Aldrich's nephew, had said something at recess that Emma reported without specifying, only noting that she'd responded by telling him to mind his own business, which she felt had been the appropriate answer. Her teacher, Miss Fowler, had asked Emma to pass along her regards to Miss Navarro, which Emma had interpreted as significant, and Elena was less certain about, but appreciated nonetheless. "Miss Fowler asked if you'd be willing to speak to the class," Emma said one evening at supper, "about bookkeeping as a skill." Cole looked up from his plate. Elena looked at Emma. "She asked you to ask me that?" "She said it might be useful for the older students." Emma ate a bite of potato. "I told her you were very good at it." "You did?" "Well, you are." Elena looked at her plate. She thought about standing in front of a classroom of children in Caldwell, Colorado, teaching bookkeeping. She thought about what her 20-year-old self would have made of that image. Probably nothing she'd have predicted, but nothing she'd have ruled out either. "I'll think about it," she said. Emma seemed satisfied. She moved on to describing a problem with her arithmetic homework that turned out, on examination, not to be a problem with arithmetic at all, but a problem with how the question had been worded, which Elena sorted out in about 2 minutes, which caused Emma to make a noise of vindication directed at no one in particular. Cole watched all of this and ate his supper. He asked her on a Sunday. It had rained the night before, real rain, the first significant rain since the drought had broken in early October, and the morning had the clean, particular smell of wet grass and turned earth that Elena had come to associate with this high Colorado country in a way she hadn't expected. She'd gone out early, before breakfast, just to stand in it. The channel was running well. The south pasture had come back greener than it had been in years, Hennessy said, and she believed it looking at it now. She heard Cole come up behind her before he said anything. She'd gotten used to the sound of him. He stood beside her. The mountains to the west were clear after the rain, every line of them sharp and close-looking. "Emma asked me last night if you were going to stay," he said. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, that it was up to you." He was quiet for a moment. "She told me that was a bad answer." Elena pressed her lips together against something that was almost a smile. "She's not wrong." "No." He pushed his hands into his pockets. He was looking at the south pasture, at the green coming back into it. "I have been thinking about how to say this for about 3 weeks, and I haven't gotten better at it, so I'm just going to say it." She waited. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as—" He stopped. "Not in the arrangement we have now. I'm asking you to stay as my wife, as Emma's mother, if that's something that—" He paused again. He was not comfortable with this. She could hear it in the pauses, the stops and starts. A man saying something real and feeling exposed by it and continuing anyway. I know that's not a small thing to ask. You came out here for something that didn't work out, and you ended up here instead, and I'm aware that's a different life than you planned. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the pasture still, jaw set, the posture of a man who is committed to something and is waiting to see what it costs. Cole, she said. He looked at her. I know it's not the life I planned, she said. The life I planned ended on a train platform with $22 in my pocket. She held his gaze. This is better. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a low bar, he said, and there was the roughness at the corner of his mouth that meant something genuine. This is considerably better than a low bar, she said. I just wanted to be clear about where I'm starting from. He turned to face her properly. Up close, in the morning light after the rain, with his hair poorly cut and his coat needing work and his face honest in the way it got when he wasn't managing it, he looked like what he was. A man who had kept something real alive through more difficulty than he'd ever admit to, and who was asking her plainly to be part of it. Is that a yes? He asked. It's a yes, she said. He nodded once, the way he did when he'd made a decision. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, held it in both of his the way you hold something you intend to keep. And they stood there in the wet grass with the mountains in front of them and the channel running quietly somewhere to the south. It wasn't a moment from a story. There was mud on her boots. His hands were rough and calloused, and one of them had a half-healed cut across the knuckle from something in the barn last week. Behind them, from this kitchen window, they heard the sound of Emma moving around making breakfast with the aggressive helpfulness she brought to tasks she'd decided were her responsibility, and the sound of something being set down harder than necessary, and then Emma's voice saying something that was probably directed at the stove. She's going to be impossible about this, Cole said. She's going to be very pleased with herself, Elena said. Same thing. Yes, Elena agreed. They were married in Greer's office on a Friday morning in November, with Greer himself as witness and Hennessy as the other, because Hennessy had insisted and because it seemed right. He'd been there from nearly the beginning and had the quality of a man who showed up when things mattered and did not make a production of it. Emma wore her best dress, which she had pressed herself with mixed results, and had redone her braids twice that morning and was pretending she hadn't. She stood beside Elena during the brief ceremony with the contained, vibrating energy of someone exercising considerable self-control. And when it was done, she hugged Elena with the full, unselfconscious force that 8-year-olds bring to things they've decided to feel completely. Elena held on. She held on longer than she'd expected to, long enough that Emma looked up at her when they separated with those dark, oversized eyes. Are you crying? Emma asked. She sounded more curious than concerned. No, Elena said. Emma looked at her. Your eyes are wet. It's a dry month, Elena said. The air. Emma considered this, apparently decided not to pursue it, and turned to accept a piece of hard candy from Hennessy, who had brought candy to a wedding because that was who Hennessy was. Cole looked at Elena over Emma's head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. So, winter came to the Walker Ranch the way it always did in that country. Not gradually, but decisively. A hard frost in late November that killed the last of the kitchen garden and put ice on the water troughs that had to be broken each morning. Elena learned the rhythms of the cold season, the way she'd learned the rhythms of everything else on this land, by paying attention and adjusting and accepting that some things didn't have a solution, just an accommodation. She wrote to her aunt in St. Louis in December. It was the first letter she'd written since the one she'd sent 2 months after her arrival, saying she hadn't come back east on the expected train and was well and would explain more later. The later had been a long time coming, and she knew it, and she sat at the desk in the office, her desk now, as much as it had been Margaret Walker's desk, though she thought about Margaret Walker often and with a complicated kind of gratitude, and wrote the full account. What had happened on the platform? The Walkers. The water rights, the hearing, all of it. She wrote, I don't know if this is what I was looking for when I left. I know it's more than I expected to find. Her aunt wrote back in January, Tets, 2 pages in the dense, practical handwriting of a woman who had run a business for 40 years and did not waste words even in personal correspondence. She said she was glad Elena hadn't gotten back on the eastbound train. She said Elena's mother would have found the whole thing exactly as exhausting and exactly as right as it sounded. She said she'd like to visit in the spring, if the offer was open. Elena wrote back the same day, saying yes. The territorial prosecutor's office made its decision in February. Greer delivered the letter in person, which Elena took as a sign the news was significant either way. She read it at the kitchen table with Cole sitting across from her and Emma doing schoolwork at the other end, making the scratching sound of pencil on paper that had become part of the house's daily texture. The office was opening a formal investigation into the channel obstruction and the fraudulent structuring of the First National loan. Holt had been notified. He had 30 days to respond before charges were formally filed. Given the evidence package Greer had submitted, which included, the letter noted, an unusually thorough documentary record, the prosecutor expected to proceed. Elena put the letter down. "He's going to settle," Cole said. He'd read it over her shoulder. "Probably." She thought about Douglas Holt, about the man she'd seen on the train platform and the man she'd seen at the courthouse, and about the space between those two appearances, the slow revelation of what had been underneath the easy assurance all along. He'll pay something, give up something, avoid the trial. Is that enough? She thought about it honestly. "It's not nothing," she said. "It's not everything either." She folded the letter. "He'll still have his ranch. He'll still have money. He'll have less power than he had, and people will know what he did, and he'll have to live with that in a small enough place that he can't entirely forget it." She paused. "That's not justice exactly. It's something more like consequence." "Is that enough for you?" She looked at him. "I didn't come here for justice," she said. "I came here for a life." She looked around the kitchen, at the table with Emma at the far end, at the window showing the winter pasture, at the accounts she'd reorganized and would continue for as long as she was here, which was going to be a long time. "I got one." Emma looked up from her schoolwork. "What did the letter say?" "Legal things," Cole said. "About Mr. Holt?" "Yes." "Is he in trouble?" Cole and Elena exchanged a glance. "Yes," Cole said. Emma processed this. "Good," she said, in exactly the tone she'd used in the courthouse hallway when she'd asked if they'd won. That same flat, unsentimental finality. She went back to her arithmetic. Spring arrived with the same decisiveness as the winter had. Overnight, almost, the way weather worked in that country. An abruptness that had startled Elena her first year, and that she now understood as just the nature of the place. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The south pasture came in thick and green, greener than Cole said he'd seen it in a decade. The water rights doing what water rights were supposed to do when someone wasn't blocking them. Roy Henderson sent a note in April saying his south well had come back, that there was water at 15 feet again for the first time in years. Carver's boys stopped by in May to report that they'd planted the lower field for the first time in 4 years. Elena's aunt arrived on the June train. She was a small, dark woman in her 60s with gray-streaked hair and the posture of someone who had carried things for a long time and had stopped noticing the weight. She stood on the Caldwell platform with a single bag at her feet, the same economy of luggage that Elena had inherited, apparently, and looked around at the main street of Caldwell with an expression Elena recognized from mirrors. Not impressed exactly, but genuinely looking, taking things seriously enough to evaluate them rather than dismiss them. Emma, who had been briefed extensively about this visit and had opinions about it, introduced herself before Elena had gotten more than 2 words out. "I'm Emma Walker," Emma said. "Elena is my mother now." Elena's aunt looked at Emma, then at Elena, with the sharp attention of a woman who does not miss things. "I can see that," she said. She stayed 2 weeks. She helped Elena reorganize the pantry stores, which she felt could be more efficient, and she was right. She taught Emma 3 card games, 2 of which Emma immediately tried to cheat at, which she also immediately got caught at, which her aunt considered both a character flaw and a sign of intelligence. She walked the south pasture one morning and stood at the channel for a long time without saying anything, and then said in Spanish, something that roughly translated to "your mother" would have done the same thing, which Elena thought about for a long time afterward. On her last evening, they sat on the porch after supper, Elena and her aunt and Cole, Emma having been persuaded into bed only after significant negotiation. And the June night was warm, and the fireflies were starting in the long grass by the fence, and the mountains were dark shapes against a sky that still held a little light at the western edge. Her aunt drank her coffee and looked at the land. "You did well," she said. She said it simply, the way she said things that mattered. No ceremony, no build-up, just the words. Elena looked at the fence line, the channel, the pasture Cole's father had built, and Cole had maintained, and that would be here after both of them. "I'm still figuring it out," she said. "Of course you are," her aunt said. "That's not a different thing from doing well. That's what doing well looks like." Cole reached over and picked up Elena's hand from the arm of her chair, just briefly, the same way he had in the wet grass the morning he'd asked her. Not a gesture for the audience of her aunt, just a thing he did. Her aunt noticed, said nothing. Drank her coffee. The summer was the best the Walker Ranch had seen in years. By any measure, Elena knew how to apply. The cattle came in strong. The hay yield was higher than Cole's estimates. The kitchen garden that had struggled through the drought came back in force, and Elena found herself canning in August with more produce than she'd expected, and less time than she'd planned, which was, she had come to understand, simply how this kind of life worked. It outran your estimates. It demanded more than you thought you had, and then surprised you with what you turned out to have. She had taken Miss Fowler up on the offer, in the end. She went to the school once a week through the spring and taught the older students basic account keeping, not bookkeeping theory, nothing abstract, just the practical work of tracking money and what it meant and what happened when you stopped paying attention to it. Some of them were bored. 2 of them were genuinely interested. One girl in particular, a daughter of a rancher in the Eastern Valley, 13 and sharp-eyed and already impatient with anything that wasted her time, had the same quality Elena recognized from her own reflection, the quality of someone who needs the work to be real in order to take it seriously. She stayed after class one afternoon, this girl, while Elena was gathering her papers. "Is it true you found the water rights document in a pile of old papers?" she asked. "Yes." "And nobody had looked at them for years?" "A long time, yes." The girl considered this. "So it mattered that you actually read things carefully." "It matters in general," Elena said. "But yes, in that case particularly." The girl nodded, absorbing this in the way she absorbed most things. Not with enthusiasm exactly, but with the serious attention of someone who is deciding whether something is worth incorporating into their understanding of how the world works. "People underestimate reading carefully," the girl said. "People underestimate a lot of things," Elena said. "Usually the ones that take time and don't look impressive while you're doing them." The girl looked at her for a moment and then picked up her bag and went. And Elena stood in the empty classroom and thought, that's one. That's one who might carry something forward. It was not a small thing. Douglas Holt settled with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office in August, 2 weeks before formal charges would have been filed. The terms were not public in their entirety, but what became known, in the way things become known in small communities through the reliable channels of hardware stores and front stoops, was that he had agreed to pay restitution to the Walker Ranch and to the Carver and Henderson properties for damages related to the channel obstruction, that he had relinquished any claim to the land he'd positioned himself to acquire through the loan arrangement, and that he had agreed to certain conditions that effectively removed him from any role in county water planning for a period of 5 years. His ranch remained his. His money remained mostly his. He was still present, still visible, still the largest landowner in the immediate area. Elena passed him once in town in September, in front of the dry goods, and they were within 10 feet of each other, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and they did not speak. There was nothing she needed to say. There was, she thought, nothing he was going to say. The accounting between them had been done in a courthouse, by a judge, on the basis of documents that said what they said. Whatever Douglas Holt thought of Elena Navarro Walker was his own business, and always had been. She went into the dry goods and bought what she'd come to buy, and drove home. Emma turned 9 in October, and they had a small gathering. The Hendersons, the Carvers, Hennessy, who brought more hard candy, and Miss Fowler from school, who turned out to drink more coffee than anyone Elena had ever met, and had strong opinions about arithmetic curricula that she and Elena ended up discussing for an hour on the porch, while Emma and Clara Henderson ran the yard with the reckless energy of children who have been inside a school building all week. Elena watched Emma run in the late afternoon light, the braids that were always coming undone, the dress that never stayed clean for more than an hour, the voice carrying across the yard as she narrated whatever game she and Clara had invented with the total authority of someone who considers herself the designated rule maker. Cole came and stood beside her. "She's going to be a problem," he said. It was what he'd said the first day, or something close to it, about Emma not giving people choices. He said it now with an entirely different quality in his voice, a thing that wasn't concern at all, dressed in the same words. "She already is," Elena said. "She's going to be a very specific kind of problem. She's going to be the kind that solves other problems and expects credit. She gets that from somewhere." Elena looked at him. He was watching Emma with the look he sometimes got in unguarded moments. The fullness of it, love without the management he put on most things. He'd had this child through 3 hard years alone, and he had not let her go under, had not let her become small or frightened, had given her whatever he had, even when what he had wasn't much. And Emma Walker was evidence of that. Emma Walker, with her undone braids and her card cheating and her complete certainty about what mattered, was the proof that Cole Walker had done something right in the years when everything else was going wrong. Elena thought about what it meant to choose a family, not to be born into one, not to marry into convenience, but to look at a specific set of people and a specific piece of land and a specific hard, imperfect life and say, "This. I choose this." Not because it's easy and not because it's perfect, but because it's real and it's worth something and I am going to be part of it. She thought about her mother, who had made that same kind of choice in a different place with different stakes, who had built something real with her hands and her stubbornness and soil that hadn't asked for her, who had not lived long enough to see it hold. Elena was going to live long enough to see it hold. She intended to. "Look," Emma called from the yard. She was pointing at something above the barn. A hawk, riding a thermal, tilting in the way hawks did, the long-winged ease of it. Clara Henderson shaded her eyes to look. Emma kept pointing as if she'd arranged it personally. Cole raised his coffee cup in the direction of the hawk. It was a very Cole Walker gesture, not sentimental, just acknowledging. Elena pressed her shoulder against his arm and watched the hawk circle until it caught something she couldn't see from the ground and folded its wings and was gone. The day went on. The sun moved west. The mountains did what mountains did. Inside the house that had been empty for too long, supper was going to need starting, and Emma was going to need calling in, and the account books were sitting on the desk with the next month's figures to work through. There was a fence section in the northwest corner that Cole said needed attention before the first hard freeze. There were letters to write and a kitchen garden to put to bed for winter and a school lesson to prepare for Thursday. All of it ordinary. All of it in the specific way of things you've earned rather than inherited. Extraordinary. Elena set down her coffee cup and went inside. She had work to do.